The morning sun glinted off the metal flagpole as James Mitchell stood back to admire his work. 20 feet of American pride now stood in his front yard, the stars and stripes dancing in the gentle breeze. He smiled, his chest swelling with the same pride he'd felt during his 22 years of military service. But that smile would fade just hours later when he found the bright yellow notice taped to his front door. Violation, unauthorized structure. Remove within 48 hours or face penalties. James crumpled the paper in his fist, his jaw tightening. He'd faced enemy fire in 3 combat zones, but somehow this piece of paper felt like a declaration of war. If you've ever had your rights trampled by power-hungry HOA members, hit that subscribe button right now. This isn't just a story about a flagpole, it's about standing up to corruption, fighting back against tyranny in your own neighborhood, and how one man's refusal to back down brought an entire community together. James Mitchell was no stranger to new beginnings. At 52, the recently retired Marine Corps veteran had spent his life moving from base to base, deployment to deployment. Oak Ridge Estates in suburban Phoenix represented something he'd never really had before: permanence, a place to finally call home. The 2-story Mediterranean-style house with its terracotta roof and desert landscaping wasn't just a property investment. It represented the stable future he'd fought for. The community itself was pristine: manicured lawns, coordinated house colors, and an atmosphere of affluent tranquility. Children played in cul-de-sacs while neighbors chatted over perfectly trimmed hedges. It all seemed perfect on the surface, and for the first 3 weeks after moving in, James had been nothing but pleased with his choice. "Welcome to Oak Ridge," his next-door neighbor Tom had said, bringing over a bottle of wine the day James moved in. "Just a friendly piece of advice. Read the HOA bylaws carefully. Victoria doesn't mess around." James had nodded politely, only half listening as he unpacked boxes. He'd dealt with military regulations his entire adult life. How strict could a homeowners association possibly be? The answer came exactly 23 days after he moved in, when he installed the flagpole. It wasn't an impulsive decision. The flag had accompanied him through 3 tours of duty, and displaying it properly mattered. So he'd researched, bought a professional-grade pole, and installed it with the precision that had defined his military career. The violation notice appeared within hours. Standing in his living room, staring out at the flagpole through his picture window, James reread the notice. It cited HOA Bylaw 7.3. No structures may be erected on properties without prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee. His phone call to the HOA office was answered by a woman whose voice carried the practiced politeness of someone used to saying no. "I'm sorry, Mr. Mitchell, but the rules are quite clear," she said. "The board president, Ms. Chambers, has personally reviewed your case." "Can I speak with her?" James asked, keeping his voice level. "Ms. Chambers is unavailable," came the clipped response. "The decision is final. The flagpole must be removed." James hung up, his military-honed tactical mind already working. If there was one thing he'd learned in his career, it was that you never enter battle without reconnaissance. Opening his laptop, he began searching through the HOA documents he'd been given when he purchased the house. What he discovered sent a chill down his spine. The violation notice wasn't just about a flagpole. It was the first shot in what would become a neighborhood war. The Oak Ridge Estates HOA rulebook was 173 pages of fine print, restrictions, and regulations. James spent the entire night reading every word, making notes and highlighting inconsistencies. By dawn, fueled by black coffee and growing indignation, he'd made 3 crucial discoveries. First, while unapproved structures were indeed prohibited, nowhere in the document were flagpoles specifically mentioned. Second, the bylaws contained an explicit statement that reasonable displays of patriotism are encouraged within community aesthetic guidelines. And third, perhaps most importantly, any enforcement action required a formal review process, not just a violation notice. Armed with this knowledge, James took a morning walk through the neighborhood. What he saw only deepened his suspicions. Board member Diana Edwards had a fountain in her front yard that clearly violated the water feature restrictions. The treasurer, Robert Hoffman, had recently painted his house a shade that wasn't on the approved color palette. And Victoria Chambers herself, the HOA president who'd apparently personally denied his flagpole, had extensive landscaping that encroached well beyond her property line. They're selectively enforcing the rules, James muttered to himself as he photographed these violations on his phone. When he returned home, another notice awaited him. This one announced a $100 daily fine until the flagpole was removed. The letterhead displayed Victoria's name and contact information. James immediately dialed her number. Ms. Chambers, this is James Mitchell from 1478 Desert Palm Drive. I'd like to discuss the flagpole situation. The voice on the other end was cool, authoritative. There's nothing to discuss, Mr. Mitchell. The rules are very clear. Actually, they're not, James countered. I've read the entire rulebook, and flagpoles aren't specifically prohibited. Additionally, the bylaws encourage patriotic displays, and as a veteran... Mr. Mitchell, Victoria interrupted, your military service, while appreciated, doesn't exempt you from community standards. The board's decision is final. Remove the flagpole or face the consequences. The call ended abruptly, leaving James staring at his phone. The dismissive tone awakened something in him, a determination he hadn't felt since his active duty days. This wasn't just about a flagpole anymore, it was about accountability. That afternoon, James filed a formal request for all HOA financial records for the past 5 years. According to the bylaws, these records were supposed to be available to any homeowner upon request. The response was immediate. Access denied pending a board review. Now truly suspicious, James began knocking on neighbors' doors. The stories he heard painted a disturbing picture. Arbitrary rule enforcement, punitive fines, and retribution against anyone who questioned the board. Most residents simply kept their heads down and paid whatever was demanded. Why doesn't anyone fight back? James asked Tom, the neighbor who'd initially welcomed him. Tom's expression grew serious. Because Victoria has ways of making life difficult for people who cross her. Last year, the Johnsons questioned a special assessment, and suddenly they were getting violation notices weekly. Eventually, they just moved away. James shook his head, a slow anger building in his chest. That's not right, and it's not legal. That night, as he researched Arizona HOA laws, James discovered something that made him sit up straight. By law, HOAs were required to maintain transparent financial records and make them available to all members. Victoria's denial wasn't just petty, it was potentially illegal. James printed out the relevant statutes and placed them in a folder. Tomorrow, he would demand those financial records again, this time with legal backing. Little did he know what he would find in those records would shake the entire community to its foundation. 3 days of persistent pressure, including a formal letter citing state law, finally granted James access to the HOA's financial records. The board treasurer, Robert Hoffman, watched nervously as James reviewed 5 years of statements, contracts, and expenditures in the community clubhouse. The records were deliberately convoluted, with vague descriptions and confusing categorizations. But James hadn't spent 2 decades in military logistics without learning how to spot irregularities. And there were plenty. "What's this?" James asked, pointing to a recurring expense labeled Enhanced Landscaping Services, Zone 3 for $8,500 per quarter. Robert shifted uncomfortably. Maintenance for the community entrance and common areas. James pulled up the community map on his phone. Zone 3 is just a small meditation garden, isn't it? Less than quarter acre? The plants there are exotic. High maintenance, Robert replied, not meeting James's eyes. James made a note and continued. By the end of the day, he'd identified over $175,000 in suspicious payments to a company called Chambers Exterior Solutions. A quick internet search confirmed his suspicions. The company was owned by Victoria's brother. No competitive bidding, no detailed invoices, and no evidence this work was actually done, James muttered as he photographed the relevant documents. That's not just unethical, it's embezzlement. But the landscaping contract was just the tip of the iceberg. There were inexplicable consulting fees, bloated administrative costs, and thousands in reimbursements to board members for unspecified expenses. The community's reserve fund, which should have contained over $500,000 for major repairs, held less than a third of that amount. Word of James' investigation spread quickly. That evening, his doorbell rang continuously as neighbors came by, first in trickles, then in streams. Each had a story to tell: excessive fines for minor violations, special assessments that seemed to disappear into thin air, intimidation when questions were raised. They fined me $750 for planting roses instead of the approved desert plants, said Eleanor, an elderly woman from down the street. Then, when I couldn't pay right away, they put a lien on my house. We've been charged 3 emergency assessments in 2 years, added Michael, a young father of 2. But the playground equipment they promised is still broken. As James listened to their stories, he realized the situation was worse than he'd imagined. This wasn't just about selective enforcement or minor financial improprieties. The HOA board had been systematically abusing their power and possibly stealing from their neighbors for years. The next morning, an emergency board meeting notice appeared on the community bulletin board. The only agenda item: legal action authorization, Mitchell property. Victoria was moving to shut down his investigation before it could go any further. James smiled grimly as he photographed the notice. Victoria clearly had no idea who she was dealing with. In his military career, Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell had served as a JAG Corps attorney, specializing in contract law and financial irregularities. He hadn't mentioned this when he moved in. He'd wanted a quiet retirement, not a legal battle. But Victoria had forced his hand. That night, James made 2 phone calls. The first was to an old colleague from the JAG Corps who now practiced civilian law in Phoenix. The second was to the State Attorney General's office, White Collar Crimes Division. As he hung up the phone, James looked out at his flagpole. The American flag now illuminated by a small spotlight as required by flag etiquette for overnight display. "This isn't just about you anymore," he said quietly to the flag. "It's about justice." The board had no idea what was coming their way, but in less than 24 hours, the HOA empire that Victoria had carefully built would begin crumbling beneath her feet. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. in the community clubhouse. By 6:30, the parking lot was already full. Word had spread like wildfire. The new guy was taking on Victoria Chambers and her iron-fisted board, and no one wanted to miss it. Inside, Victoria sat at the head of a long table, flanked by her loyal board members. Her expression was confident, even smug, as she reviewed papers with Robert and Diana. Occasionally, she glanced at the door, her lips tightening as more and more residents filtered in. At precisely 6:55, James Mitchell entered the room. The casual desert attire he'd worn since moving in was gone, replaced by a crisp charcoal suit that highlighted his military bearing. Behind him walked 3 people carrying briefcases, 2 men and a woman, all in professional attire. A hush fell over the crowd. This wasn't the intimidated homeowner Victoria had expected. "Mr. Mitchell," Victoria said, her voice carrying across the now packed room. "This meeting is for board members only until the open session begins at 7:30. James smiled politely as he approached the table. "Actually, Ms. Chambers, according to Arizona Revised Statute 33-1804 and your own bylaws, all homeowners may attend the entirety of any board meeting. Only executive sessions discussing pending litigation or personnel matters may be closed." He placed a document in front of her. "And since I am the subject of your agenda item, legal action authorization, I have particular standing to be present." Victoria's face flushed as she glanced at the state statute he'd referenced. "Fine," she snapped, "but your associates will need to wait outside." "These are my legal representatives," James replied calmly. "And according to your bylaws, homeowners may bring legal counsel to any meeting where actions against them are being discussed." Victoria looked to Robert, who gave a small, uncomfortable nod confirming James was correct. "Now," James continued, "before you begin your planned action against me, I believe there's a more pressing matter the board needs to address." He opened his briefcase and removed a thick folder. "Specifically, the financial irregularities I've discovered in reviewing the association's records." Victoria's eyes narrowed. This meeting has a specific agenda, Mr. Mitchell. Your concerns can be addressed at next month's regular meeting. I'm afraid this can't wait, James replied, his voice carrying throughout the now silent room. Not when it involves the potential misappropriation of over $300,000 of community funds. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Victoria's face went from flushed to pale in an instant. This is absurd, she declared, banging her gavel. Security, please remove Mr. Mitchell for disrupting the meeting. The community's part-time security guard, a retired police officer named Ray, shifted uncomfortably by the door but made no move to intervene. James remained perfectly composed. Before anyone does anything rash, you should know that I've already filed a formal complaint with the state attorney general's office. Their white-collar crimes division found my evidence compelling enough to open an investigation. He placed a business card on the table, the card of the state investigator he'd spoken with. They're particularly interested in the contracts awarded to Chambers Exterior Solutions without competitive bidding, proper documentation, or, in many cases, evidence that work was actually performed. Victoria's Brothers Company. The revelation hit the room like a thunderclap. Victoria's hands began to shake, though her face remained frozen in a mask of indignation. This is slander, she hissed. You have no proof of any wrongdoing. Actually, James said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small recorder. I do. The small digital recorder sat on the table like a grenade with its pin pulled. Victoria stared at it, her composure finally cracking. Recording board meetings is permitted under Arizona law and your own bylaws, James said calmly. And this isn't from today's meeting. He pressed play and Victoria's voice filled the suddenly silent room. We'll need to increase the quarterly dues again, the recorded Victoria was saying. Another 15% should cover it. That's the third increase in 2 years, came Robert's voice in response. People are already complaining. So let them complain, Victoria's recording continued. Call it infrastructure improvements or whatever. We need the money for the Sedona property, and I'm not taking out a conventional loan when we have a community full of cash cows. James stopped the recording. The room had gone completely still, every eye fixed on Victoria, whose face had turned the color of ash. That was from 3 months ago, James explained to the stunned crowd. A private conversation between Ms. Chambers and Mr. Hoffman that occurred in this very room after they thought everyone had left a committee meeting. I was outside the window retrieving a folder I'd forgotten. He turned to face the homeowners. They were discussing using your increased HOA fees to purchase a vacation property in Sedona. A property that, according to county records, was indeed purchased 2 months ago by Victoria Chambers and Robert Hoffman. The room erupted. Shouts of "thieves" and "call the police" rang out from all corners. Victoria tried to bang her gavel, but no one was listening anymore. This meeting is adjourned, she shouted, gathering her papers hastily. Actually, James said, his voice somehow cutting through the chaos. It isn't. According to the bylaws, a board meeting can only be adjourned by majority vote of the board or by completion of all agenda items. He turned to the other board members, who were now physically distancing themselves from Victoria. Would the remaining board members care to vote on whether to continue this meeting under new leadership? Diana Edwards, who had served as Victoria's loyal secretary for years, looked at the fury on the faces of her neighbors. Then she looked at the evidence James had laid out. Her decision was clear. I move that Victoria Chambers and Robert Hoffman be immediately suspended from the board pending investigation, and that we continue this meeting under the leadership of Vice President Garcia, she said, her voice trembling but resolute. The motion was seconded and quickly passed, with only Victoria and Robert opposing. Carlos Garcia, a soft-spoken retired teacher who had been largely sidelined during Victoria's reign, moved to the head of the table. I think we all need to understand exactly what's happened here, and he said, Mr. Mitchell, would you please share what you've found with everyone? For the next hour, James methodically presented the evidence he'd gathered. The inflated contracts, the missing reserve funds, the selective enforcement used to intimidate anyone who asked questions. With each revelation, the community's shock deepened into anger, then hardened into resolve. Victoria and Robert remained silently in their seats, all pretense of authority now gone. When James finished his presentation, Carlos called for a vote. All those in favor of removing Victoria Chambers and Robert Hoffman from the board effective immediately and reporting all financial findings to the proper authorities, please raise your hands. Every hand in the room went up. All those in favor of forming a special committee to review all HOA policies and financial records, to be headed by James Mitchell, please raise your hands. Again, a forest of hands rose into the air. As the meeting finally adjourned, homeowners surrounded James, shaking his hand, patting his back, some even hugging him with tears in their eyes. The flagpole that had started it all was now the least of anyone's concerns. Something much more important had been raised in its place. Hope for a community free from tyranny and corruption. Outside in the parking lot, Victoria tried to slip away unnoticed, but found her exit blocked by Ray, the security guard. "I'm sorry, Miss Chambers," he said, not sounding sorry at all. "The police are on their way, and they've asked that everyone involved remain on the premises." Victoria's empire had fallen, and as James watched from the clubhouse steps, he knew the real work of rebuilding the community was just beginning. In the days following what became known as the Showdown, Oak Ridge Estates transformed from a neighborhood of disconnected individuals into a united community with a common purpose. The flagpole that had started it all became a symbol of the change, a reminder that standing up for principles could ripple outward in unexpected ways. State investigators descended on the HOA office, carting away boxes of documents and digital records. What they found exceeded even James's discoveries. Over 5 years, Victoria and her allies had misappropriated more than $300,000 through inflated contracts, fraudulent reimbursements, and outright theft. It's one of the most brazen cases of HOA fraud we've seen, the lead investigator told reporters from the local news, which had picked up the story. They weren't even particularly clever about hiding it. The media attention brought other HOA communities forward with similar stories, prompting the state legislature to begin drafting stronger oversight laws. Oak Ridge Estates, once known only for its pristine appearance, was becoming famous for something far more valuable: integrity. Victoria and Robert both resigned from the board via tersely worded emails, but their departures were merely formalities. The interim board, now led by Carlos with James serving as treasurer, discovered that the corruption went even deeper than initially thought. "They've been falsifying reserve study reports," James explained at an emergency community meeting, referring to the documents that outlined future major expenses. "The pool needs resurfacing, the clubhouse roof is failing, and the irrigation system is held together with duct tape and prayers. They've been hiding these issues while draining the funds that should have fixed them." The news hit homeowners hard. Years of artificially low maintenance had created a looming financial crisis that would require special assessments to address. But unlike before, when such announcements would have been met with anger and suspicion, the community responded with determination. "We'll fix what's broken," said Eleanor, the elderly woman who'd been fined for planting roses. Both the physical structures and the community itself. The healing process began with a special election to form a new permanent board. Unlike previous elections, which had been quietly announced and sparsely attended, this one saw record participation. Nearly every homeowner cast a vote, and James, despite his initial reluctance, was elected president by an overwhelming margin. His first official act was to create a transparency committee tasked with rewriting the HOA bylaws to prevent future abuses. His second was to establish a formal complaint process that required board responses within 48 hours. And his third was to formally approve his own flagpole, along with new guidelines ensuring that all homeowners could display flags with pride. Meanwhile, Victoria's carefully constructed life began to unravel. Her real estate license was suspended pending investigation. Her brother's company was barred from government contracts after his role in the scheme came to light. And the vacation property in Sedona, purchased with community funds, was seized as evidence. 3 months after the showdown, on a warm Saturday morning, the community gathered in the newly repaired park for an unveiling ceremony. A large object stood covered in the center of the lawn, surrounded by curious residents. James stepped forward, looking more comfortable now in casual clothes than he had in his suit that fateful night. When I moved here, he began, I was looking for peace and quiet after a long military career. Instead, I found corruption and intimidation. He paused, looking around at the faces of his neighbors, no longer strangers, but friends. But I also found courage, resilience, and ultimately, community. He pulled away the covering to reveal a large boulder with a brass plaque. Engraved on it were the words, The Oak Ridge Promise, Integrity, Transparency, Community. Establishment 2025. As applause broke out, James felt a tap on his shoulder. It was Tom, the neighbor who'd first warned him about Victoria. You know, Tom said, when you put up that flagpole, I thought you were crazy to take on Victoria. Never in a million years did I imagine it would lead to all this. James smiled, looking up at the community entrance where another flagpole now stood, visible to all who entered Oak Ridge Estates. Sometimes, he said, you have to fight for what's right, even when it seems like a small thing. But as they would soon discover, the battle wasn't quite over yet. Victoria Chambers had lost her power, but she hadn't lost her desire for revenge. 6 months after the showdown, Oak Ridge Estates had transformed from a collection of houses into a true community. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now greeted each other by name. The clubhouse, previously Victoria's domain, buzzed with book clubs, game nights, and committee meetings where residents actively participated in decision-making. Under James's leadership, the board had established unprecedented transparency. All financial records were available online. Meetings were live-streamed for those who couldn't attend in person, and quarterly reports detailed every dollar spent. The Homeowners' Bill of Rights, drafted collaboratively by residents, ensured that rules would be enforced fairly and consistently. The physical community was changing too. With proper funding now directed to maintenance, the aging infrastructure was being systematically repaired. But more noticeably, the rigid conformity that had characterized Oak Ridge was giving way to tasteful individuality. Gardens bloomed with diverse flowers, not just the approved desert varieties. Front porches featured rocking chairs and small benches where conversations happened organically. And flagpoles, the spark that had ignited everything, now dotted the neighborhood. American flags predominantly, but also military service flags, sports team banners, and seasonal decorations. Each one represented not just personal expression, but the freedom that came from breaking Victoria's oppressive regime. For James, the greatest satisfaction came not from his position as board president, but from watching democracy in action. At each meeting, residents debated issues passionately but respectfully. Decisions were reached through consensus, not dictatorial pronouncements. We've created something special here, Carlos told him one evening, as they reviewed plans for renovating the community playground. People from other HOAs are asking how we did it. This was true. Representatives from neighboring communities had begun attending Oak Ridge meetings, taking notes on their governance model. Local news had done a follow-up story titled The HOA Revolution, featuring James and the community's transformation. But not everyone was celebrating Oak Ridge's renaissance. Victoria Chambers, facing criminal charges and civil lawsuits, watched from the shadows as her former kingdom flourished without her. Her bitterness grew with each community success, each news story, each improvement that erased her legacy. She made her move on a crisp fall morning when most residents were at work. A process server approached James's door delivering a thick legal document. Victoria was suing the HOA, the board members individually, and James specifically for defamation, harassment, and violation of her civil rights. She claimed that his investigation had been a personal vendetta, that the evidence had been falsified, and that he had orchestrated a coup to seize control. The lawsuit demanded $2.5 million in damages. James called an emergency board meeting that evening. The community room filled beyond capacity as word spread. This is clearly retaliatory, James explained, projecting the lawsuit on the wall for all to see. She's hoping we'll settle to avoid legal costs or that our insurance will pay her off to make it go away. Can she actually win? asked Michael, the young father who had previously complained about the failed playground improvements. James shook his head. The evidence against her is overwhelming, but defending against even a frivolous lawsuit is expensive and time-consuming. Our HOA insurance will cover some costs, but there may be additional expenses. A tense silence fell over the room. After months of progress, Victoria had found a way to threaten their community once more. Then Eleanor, the woman with the rose garden, stood up. At 78, she was the oldest resident in Oak Ridge and rarely spoke at meetings. But when she did, people listened. "I've lived here longer than anyone," she said, her voice thin but determined. "I watched Victoria take control, bit by bit, meeting by meeting, when no one else would step up. I paid her fines because I was afraid of losing my home." She paused, looking around the room. "I won't be afraid again. I'll contribute $1,000 to a legal defense fund." For a moment, the room was silent. Then another resident stood up. "I'll match that." Another stood. "Me too." Within 10 minutes, residents had pledged over $30,000 to fight Victoria's lawsuit. James felt a lump in his throat as he watched neighbors, some who could ill afford it, offering what they could to protect their transformed community. Their attorney, one of the lawyers who had accompanied James to the showdown, filed a motion to dismiss Victoria's suit and countersued for malicious prosecution. The judge, already familiar with Victoria from the criminal proceedings, took less than a week to throw out her lawsuit and award sanctions against her for filing a frivolous claim. The victory celebration at the clubhouse that weekend wasn't just about defeating Victoria one final time. It was about confirming what Oak Ridge had become: a community where neighbors stood together, where principles mattered more than property values, and where democracy had replaced dictatorship. As James raised a glass to toast his neighbors, he glanced out the window at the flag flying above the community entrance. It moved gently in the evening breeze, illuminated by the spotlight he had personally installed. The sight filled him with a pride he hadn't felt since his military days. The pride of having fought for something that mattered, and won. 1 year to the day after James Mitchell installed the flagpole that changed everything, Oak Ridge Estates held a community celebration. Tables lined the newly landscaped park, laden with potluck dishes that reflected the diversity of the residents. Eleanor's traditional English scones beside Michael's Puerto Rican arroz con gandules. Tom's beer-battered fish next to the Patel's vegetable samosas. Children played on the colorful new playground equipment. Seniors chatted in the shade of pergolas that hadn't existed a year ago, and everywhere there was laughter. The atmosphere wasn't just festive, it carried a sense of shared victory, of obstacles overcome together. James moved through the crowd, greeting neighbors who had become friends. He stopped to admire Mrs. Chen's photos of her garden transformation. From the strictly regulated desert landscaping to a vibrant hybrid that incorporated both water-wise plants and colorful flowers that would have earned hefty fines under Victoria's regime. "The Garden Club wants you to be a judge at our spring competition," Mrs. Chen told him, beaming. Before James could respond, his phone buzzed with a news alert. He glanced down at the screen, then looked up with a mixture of satisfaction and solemnity. "Everyone?" he called out, his voice carrying across the park. The chatter died down as faces turned toward him. "I just received news that I think we should all hear together." He held up his phone. "Victoria Chambers and Robert Hoffman have accepted a plea deal in their criminal case. They've pleaded guilty to embezzlement and fraud in exchange for reduced sentences. They'll each serve 18 months in prison, followed by 5 years of probation, and will pay restitution of $300,000 to our community." A murmur ran through the crowd. Not cheers or celebration, but a collective exhale. The final chapter was closing on the Victoria era. "I don't take joy in anyone's imprisonment," James continued, "but I do take satisfaction in justice being served. The money they've been ordered to repay won't just refill our reserves. We've decided to use a portion of it for something special." He gestured toward Carlos, who unveiled a large presentation board. On it was a rendering of a small house. "This is the Freedom Fund project," James explained. "Using the recovered money, we're purchasing a home within Oak Ridge that will be specifically reserved for military veterans transitioning to civilian life. They'll be able to live rent-free for up to 2 years while they establish themselves in new careers." The announcement drew applause and nods of approval. It was fitting. The corruption money would now serve those who had served their country. But there's more, James continued. Property values in Oak Ridge have increased 15% over the past year, more than double the rate of surrounding communities. This news brought outright cheers. Home equity was growing because of their collective work to improve the community. People want to live here now, James said with a smile. Not just because of the location or the amenities, but because of the community we've built together. 3 homes sold last month above asking price, and the new owners specifically mentioned our governance model as a selling point. As the celebration continued into the evening, James found himself standing beside the community flagpole with Tom and Eleanor. The three looked up at the stars and stripes, now gently illuminated in the twilight. "You know what's funny," Tom said. "That flag and pole cost you about $250, but it ended up being worth hundreds of thousands to all of us." Eleanor nodded. "And not just in money, in dignity, in community." James smiled. "Sometimes the things worth fighting for don't seem like much at first. Just a symbol, just a principle. Just a neighborhood," Eleanor added. As darkness fell completely, the spotlight on the flag grew more pronounced, casting its glow over the 3 friends. In the distance, the sounds of the community celebration continued. Laughter, music, the clink of glasses and toasts. "A year ago, I was just looking for a quiet place to retire," James said, his voice soft. "I never expected to find a cause, a purpose." "And we never expected to find a leader," Tom replied, placing a hand on James's shoulder. "Funny how life works out." Above them, the flag that had started it all continued to wave gently in the evening breeze, now a symbol not just of national pride, but of a community that had found its voice, its courage, and its heart. As for that original flagpole in James's front yard, the one that had launched the revolution, it still stood proudly, exactly where he had placed it 1 year ago. But now it was just one of many in Oak Ridge Estates. A community forever changed because one man decided to take a stand.